Okay, can you see my presentation slide?
Yes.
Great, thank you. All right, and this is my twin brother, Charlie. This is me on the left-hand side. And we are with Food Safety Guides. We're a consulting group where we focus on empowering teams and existing human resources to be able to contribute and develop food safety plans. So if you'd like to ask me any questions afterwards, you're more than welcome to. I look forward to going through this presentation with you guys. All right, so here's our agenda. First, we're going to jump into FSMA and the difference between FSMA and regulation, just so we can be speaking the same language. We're then going to jump into supply chain program, just a general introduction to what the requirements are, and there'll be a short discussion about how they're intended to be executed. We'll use some examples. The scenarios are what I'm really excited about. I find that the supply chain program is a very difficult thing to give a presentation on if it's not visual. If it's text heavy, it's going to be a very painful presentation, but also it doesn't really make it easy to communicate the relationships between the different sections of the code. So I'm going to be using two very visual scenarios, and we'll open up the floor then for questions and answer. And you people that we will see, you're more than welcome to stick around or jump off at that time. So let's jump in. Okay, so the biggest confusion I see across the industry, domestic and abroad, is not understanding the difference between law and regulation. And I think that this distinction, these distinctions will help us in our communications moving forward. So law starts as a bill and it moves through Congress. Okay, so this is where we saw the Food Safety Modernization Act, along with all the other acts, like the one it amended, the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. These are not things that are used to regulate industry. They are used to define the scope and authority of FDA. So when the bill is passed as an act and signed into law, it becomes a part of the US code. So that's where you find the definitions of adulterated and misbranded, for example. You'll often see in the code it referring to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. That's where those definitions live. So these laws can be used by FDA in a way to regulate industry. But when we're talking about FDA regulating the industry, we're talking not about the US code so much, we're talking about the CFR, and we're going to be talking about that a lot today. That's the Code of Federal Regulations. Most of you, being already GFSI, are very familiar with this, but I figured I'd spend about 20, 30 seconds making sure that everyone's on the same page. We're going to be talking about the CFR, and in some cases, laws, but for the most part, the CFR. This is what's used to regulate industry, and that's where your documentation comes into play. Okay, so oh, it appears that my microphone is muted temporarily. Okay, so the Food Safety Modernization Act was 89 pages of statutes, also known as laws. They're organized into 4 different titles. This act issued forward through FDA 7 foundational rules. So we're not gonna be focusing on all of these rules. We're gonna be focusing just on number 2 here, which is the known as the Preventive Controls for Human Food rule. And this is how it's laid out in the code. I find that if the first part to really onboarding people within your company to understanding what the regulations require is getting them fluent in how to navigate the code. So here we can see we're looking at Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations, and we're looking at Part 117. So this is what it looks like if we zoom out a little bit. And we're going to be just focusing on that last subpart, which is subpart G, Supply Chain Program. And this is what it looks like. Again, this is pretty, text-heavy slides aren't too helpful in explaining subpart G, but these are all the different sections we're going to be covering. And the one thing that gets me about the layout of this code is that last line, 117.475, records documenting the supply chain program. because once you finish reading all of these general requirements and other sections, 475 really circles back and then identifies all the records that would be used through the regulation. It's a challenge to read, because once you finish the subpart G, you then need to go back and then start identifying where these records might be most applicable. So we're going to be using some visuals today to sort of better introduce you to the regulations and the records associated with them. Okay, so why is it called a supply chain program instead of a supplier program? FDA makes a big deal out of this in the preamble. If you're not familiar with the preamble, it's every time there was a proposed version of the rule, and that includes the finalized rule, there's a preamble that gives some context to the rule. It's a question and answer format, and the questions are posed typically by stakeholders, but it could also be by fellow regulators, local and state. And FDA then is obligated to answer those responses. And so the preamble is a great place to learn more about how the rules, these new regulations apply to your business. Keyword searches for, if you're dealing with milk or even seafood, you'll find very quickly the exemptions or discussions around your commodity, which I think is very useful. Okay, so that's the preamble. Now, why are we calling it a supply chain program instead of a supplier program? Well, in this case, I have an example of a farm supplying to a receiving facility. But FDA understood that there were going to be other entities that were going to be playing an important role. These are called, by FDA in the preamble, these are called non-suppliers. So in this case, I have an image of a transporter, but it could be a packing house, it could be some other kind of aggregator, it could be a distributor, a freight forwarder. There are a lot of people in the supply chain that would be able to pass documentation, but also take part in reviewing and assessing the work of suppliers. And those reviews and assessments, if documented, could be passed through the supply chain. And so FDA decided to call the supplier program a supply chain program in their final rule, because they felt that they needed to be able to illustrate or emphasize the role that non-suppliers could play. So here in this case, the receiving facility might not necessarily need to reach all the way back to the farm. They might be able to reach just back to a packing house or a transporter. And this entity in the supply chain, which we're calling a non-supplier, will be able to move the documentation downstream to the receiving facility. They're not obligated to do that, but FDA is pretty vocal in their preamble, saying that they have confidence that if these other entities in the supply chain are going to be competitive, they're going to make life easier for the receiving facilities. So in this case, the receiving facility is subject to the food safety plan requirements, so parts C and G of the Preventive Controls for Human Food Rule, and they're receiving an ingredient from a supplier. Okay, so that's what makes a receiving facility. We'll go into that a little bit later. So in this case, we have an example of an entity in the supply chain that is not the supplier participating in the supply chain program. Here we have these entities in between the supplier and the receiving facility choosing not to participate, and they're perfectly okay in not participating. It might hurt it might help their competition, but they're not obligated to participate necessarily. So if that's the case, if you have a packing house or a distributor, somebody that's not participating in the supply chain program with you, you are obligated to reach around that entity and pull the assurance from the supplier if you are required to implement a supply chain preventive control. So some of you, I know I have plenty of clients where, especially dealing with grains, for example, where the supply chain, the entities across the supply chain between the supplier, the farm, and their facility are just not ready to participate. So we are experiencing a lot of growing pains across the food industries under FDA, and this supply chain program will hopefully get easier over time. The regulations are also still being rolled out depending on your size. So we're seeing real growing pains at this moment. Okay, so when we're talking about the supply chain, I'm talking about downstream or upstream. So in this case, I've used a little yellow box to indicate who I am. I'm a factory, and I'm producing something. Let's say it's cheese, and I'm selling my food downstream. So this little gray bar at the very top is intended for transporters. And down below, I have other entities. So from my factory, it goes to a transporter who brings it to a distributor's warehouse. The distributor then uses a truck to deliver it to a retailer. And so this would be an example of all the entities that might be downstream from my facility. Okay, to be a receiving facility, you have to be subject to C and G of Part 117. In other words, the hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls subpart, so the food safety plan subpart, and subpart G, which is also part of the supply chain, excuse me, also a part of the food safety plan, is the supply chain program subpart. So you do need to be subject to both these parts if you are going to be a receiving facility. So if you have not identified a hazard that requires a supply chain applied control, you would not need a supply chain program. So none of this would really be applicable to you. Just be aware of that. So this is the first condition for being a receiving facility. The second condition is that that the receiving facility manufactures, processes a raw material or other ingredient that it receives from a supplier. So if you're entirely vertically integrated on site, you would not be considered a receiving facility. You would have to receive an ingredient from someone else. Okay, so those are the two conditions. Now, if we turn our head and start looking up the supply chain, oftentimes the supply chain becomes much more detailed, much more complicated. So let's look at the definition of a supply chain applied control. This means a preventive control for a hazard in a raw material or other ingredient when the hazard in the raw material or other ingredient is controlled before its receipt. So if you are going to be applying a control for a food, for example, if you're receiving raw milk and you're pasteurizing it on site, that would be a case where you would not be relying on a supply chain applied control, at least not for the microbes. If you're testing for antibiotics on site, that's another example where you are controlling, in a sense, you're verifying that the hazard is under control. Okay, so now that we have an image of the supply chain available to us, we can start identifying what these entities are. Now, it might be the case that the farm is your supplier, and that everyone else would be a non-supplier. So we will be taking a look at some scenarios where that's not necessarily the case. While the farmer might be producing food, they may very well not be the supplier. So we'll go into the details there. Okay. So what you're required to do with a supply chain applied control is to verify the supply chain applied control is in fact happening. Now, you don't have to do that. What you can do is obtain the documentation of the appropriate verification activity from another entity that has reviewed and assessed, that has, well, there's a condition, let me rephrase that. You can rely on an entity that reviews and assesses documentation coming from up the supply chain. And with that documented assessment, you can go ahead and perform an assessment of their assessment, and that is acceptable as well. So we're not finding that we're not entirely dependent on our supplier. We could be dependent on our non-supplier providing us with either the verification documentation or a review and assessment, which we can then review and assess ourselves. Okay, so I mentioned this earlier, and hopefully we will be able to see entities across the supply chain make themselves more competitive and assist receiving facilities in collecting the necessary documentation. All right, so now what I'd like to do is sort of run through what a supply chain program looks like. A supply chain program cannot exist without there first being a hazard analysis. remember, you are required by FDA to first identify a hazard that requires a supply chain applied control. If you do not identify a supply chain applied control, a hazard that requires a supply chain applied control, you're not required to have a supply chain program at all. So if you identify supply chain applied control, we're going to use as an example milk. So in this case, I'm using cheese. We have milk, rennet, salt, cultures, and perhaps herbs and spices. These are the things typically that go into cheese. I thought it made it a very simple example. So let's take a look at milk. I would first, in the hazard analysis, identify all the hazards, the universe of hazards that are possible. And this is a metaphor that FDA uses in their preamble. Within this universe, you'd select those hazards that are known or reasonably foreseeable, and that would be considered to some degree severe. We would next identify the hazards requiring a supply chain applied control. So in this case, I've identified antibiotics as being a potential chemical hazard, which requires a supply chain applied control. And I need there to be zero antibiotic, the total absence of antibiotics in the milk. So this is my supply chain applied control. So now, what kind of verification activity am I going to use? Now, a lot of dairies, they'll do the testing themselves. Let's imagine I'm relying on something in the supply chain or from the farmer himself. Now, I have 4 doors I can walk through for verification activities. I can rely on an on-site audit. Now, the farmers don't typically like on-site audits, and if I'm concerned about antibiotics, it may not be the #1 type of verification I would go with, just due to resistance. Sampling and testing, now with the pasteurized milk ordinance, there is already a requirement for sampling and testing. So I could choose sampling and testing as an appropriate verification activity, and it just so happens that it would also be very much easier to go ahead and implement. Now, those aren't my only 2 doors. I can walk through a 3rd door, which is a review of food safety records. And so this might be how the animals are being managed, for example, with the application of different drugs. So there is a 4th option, and that is it's appropriate supplier verification activities based on supplier performance and risk associated with raw material or other ingredient. This really is, it's anything that might be considered the equivalent of the previous 3. But FDA does leave that door open so you can go ahead and walk through it and choose another style of verification. Okay, so now I'm gonna choose sampling and testing in this case, but there's still 4 things I have to consider as I consider the verification activity and the frequency at which it should be performed. I need to consider the hazard analysis and nature of that hazard. In this case, if cows are being treated with antibiotics, it's going to be in their system for a certain period of time as they heal from whatever it is they might be treated for. So I need to consider the hazard analysis and the nature of that hazard. I also need to consider the entities applying the control. So in this case, it would be the farm, but I could rely on multiple entities contributing to the reduction of there being a hazard, a significant hazard. 3, compliance with applicable regulations. So I don't have too many additional regulations here. I should consider perhaps the pasteurized milk ordinance. But in some cases, depending on what you're buying, it could be regulations applicable to low acid canned foods. It could be the produce safety rule. So FDA does want you to consider what is required of the supplier under other regulations, and then any other relevant information. You might want to be aware of recalls that may be troubling this commodity or this supplier, and that could include import alerts as well. So we're required to determine verification activities and then determine the frequency, and these are the things that we would need to consider as we're evaluating those things. So once we're ready to approve a supplier, we'll have to document that approval on approved supplier list. This would indicate the supplier information, so their name, perhaps their address, contact information, You'd identify the food that's been approved to be purchased by from the supplier, and then the verification activity and frequency. So that was something deriving from our evaluation. And then finally, receiving procedures. We're required to document how it is we intend to receive this food. So there has been some confusion also about the definition of food. It does include foods, what are called food components, and that includes primary packaging material. So if we would like to talk about this towards the end of the presentation, there's some more information on that I can provide you with. Okay, so moving on to verification activities. Now you're just required to go ahead and document those receiving procedures are being carried out, and then go ahead and retain the verification documentation that you're collecting. So those could be the reviews and assessments from another entity in the supply chain other than your supplier, or it could be the verification documentation you get directly from your supplier. It would also be your documented review and assessment if you're actually performing one. Okay, so if a supplier is not controlling hazards, if you have any reason to believe that it's that supplier is failing to do their job, you are required in the supply chain program regulations to take prompt corrective action, and that would be something that would make sure that the food is not going to be adulterated or misbranded. So I mentioned earlier, regulations are used to regulate industry, but here we do have a couple of laws, which are the definition of adulterated and misbranded. Okay. So moving on to the last step here is the requirement to reevaluate your supply chain program. Is it deficient? Have conditions changed? Do I have new information that could indicate that my controls will not be effective in the long run? At a minimum, you're required to reassess your supply chain program once every 3 years. So that's consistent with the reanalysis requirement in subpart C. So at a minimum, you're reevaluating your supply chain program once every 3 years, but you do need to consider when it's deficient and when there's new information or conditions change with your supplier. So it is very supplier specific. You know, you might be in your evaluation of suppliers, you might decide one is riskier than another, and they might be supplying you with the same commodity. So these are, you are evaluating not just the food and how it's being regulated here, you're also considering supplier performance. And FDA does want you to consider their performance outside of your commodity. So if they're selling other foods that are subject to import alert, or they were hit with a warning letter, and there was some writing about other types of foods or maybe other facilities under their ownership, you do want to be sensitive to supplier performance in all its manifestations. Okay, so now on to the really fun stuff. We're going on to scenarios. In this case, I'm going to stick with cheese, and we're going to look at a creamery purchasing milk from a domestic dairy farm. The chemical here is antibiotics, as I mentioned before. And we want to make sure that they're testing for antibiotics before we're sold food. And again, some dairies, you know, most creameries will be doing testing themselves, but this is just for the purposes of an example. So the farmer conducts the testing to comply with the PMO, so he's selling his grade A milk. And it just so happens he gets an order from a supplier, from a buyer that wants to buy his milk. So he gives it to a transporter, and the bulk transporter then delivers it to the creamery. Creamery makes the cheese, gives it to another transporter who brings it to a distributor warehouse where it sits until it's purchased. A distributor then puts it on their truck and sends it to the retailer to be consumed. Okay, so that's the whole supply chain. All right, so question is, who's the receiving facility? So is it A, the farmer, B, the transporter, C, the factory where the cheese is being made, or anyone else down the supply chain? All right, so a quick hint is a receiving facility means a facility that is subject to C and G of this part. Okay, so it's also someone that's receiving a good from a supplier. So in this case, the only facility that's really subject to C&G would be the factory making the cheese, because the transporters are not subject to 117. The farm is not subject necessarily, but if they were, they would also not be receiving a food from a supplier. So factory would be the only one here that would be subject to C&G. The warehouse would likely benefit from some modified requirements. So that's receiving facility. Who's the supplier? Well, just a hint, a supplier means an establishment that manufactures or processes the food, raises the animal, or grows the food that is provided to a receiving facility without further manufacturing processing by another establishment, except for manufacturing processing that consists solely of the addition of labeling or similar activity of de minimis nature. That's really important because people who you're buying from very well may not be your supplier. So under the Bioterrorism Act of 2002, there was the establishment and establishment maintenance of records, where you needed to maintain records one step forward, one step back. This is very different. This is asking that you go to your supplier, and your supplier is not necessarily the person you purchase the food from. In our example, the factory is receiving the food, so C is receiving the food from transporter B, but the transporter is certainly not doing much at all to the food, nothing beyond a de minimis nature. And so the answer would be the farm. Okay. So a lot of people get confused about manufacturing and processing. What does that include? So the definition of manufacturing and processing is making food from one or more ingredients, or synthesizing, preparing, treating, modifying, or manipulating food, including the food crops or ingredients. So it's a little different for farms and farm mix type facilities, because the manufacturing processing would not include the activities that are part of harvesting, packing, or holding. This is where it gets a little confusing for people. FDA did give an example, a list of examples of manufacturing processing activities, and these are them. But you'll notice that they mention labeling, and labeling has already been called out as something that's considered of de minimis nature. So if you happen to be freezing, freezing is not a de minimis nature. So if you're buying blueberries, for example, that are frozen, your supplier would not be the grower, it would be the person who froze the blueberries. Now, if that's the grower as well, okay, I understand. But there are some circumstances where your supplier may not be the farmer. In our case, it's going to be the farmer. So let's move on to who is a non-supplier. So what are the other entities that does not include the supplier? So this is looking from the perspective of the factory. So in this case, the non-supplier would be this transporter here. So it's an entity in the supply chain that is not supplying the food, and it would be between the real supplier and the receiving facility. So here we have a non-supplier. This person, if belonging to a distributor, for example, could go ahead and bring the documentation or perform some kind of activity or assessment and share that with the factory. In this case, it's not likely. It's likely the bulk transporter would simply drop off milk at the factory. Okay, now last question here is who's the customer? In this case, it's anything other than the receiving facility's supplier. But looking downstream, it could be any one of these, D, E, F, or G. Okay, likely scenario, the farmer would apply the supply chain applied control, provide the cheesemaker with the documentation by giving it to the transporter, who would then give it to the factory, and they would go ahead and either review it and document it, or they would document the review and assessment of something already reviewed and documented by the transporter. Okay, so let's look at a more detailed scenario where we're focusing on foreign suppliers. So in this case, I have some pepper jack cheese slices, and this is made with dry jalapeno flakes. So what we're concerned about are salmonella. All right, so just to remind you that this is going to be the whole supply chain, and in the gray bar we have transporters, and down below we're going to have farms and facilities. Okay, so that's how it's a very long supply chain. I think it has 19 entities. So I'm using sort of space and color to try and help you distinguish between the two types of entities. Okay, on the right-hand side, we're going to have domestic entities, and on the left-hand side in the gray area, we're going to have foreign facilities. Excuse me, foreign entities. Okay, so let's get started. It's going to go pretty quick. The farmer grows and harvests the jalapenos. They hand them over to a transporter. The transporter trucks these jalapenos to a packing house. The packing house consolidates these jalapenos in crates and labels and hands them off to a transporter, who then transports them to a processor. This processor goes ahead and heat treats them, dries and flakes, and packages in modified atmosphere packaging the jalapenos in this little bottle, as you can see above. These bottles are then taken by a transporter and taken to a distributor's warehouse, where they wait until they're exported to the United States. The way that this product gets to the US is through a freight forwarder. So it could be coming from air or boat, for example. And it's brought into customs, where it's moved through by an importer. In this case, we have an importer of record that's moving the jalapeno flakes through customs. There are some conditions if you're an importer. Under the FSVP regulations, an importer means a US owner or consignee of an article of food that's being offered for import into the US. So if there is no owner or consignee of the article of the food at the time of entry, the importer in this case would be the US agent or representative of the foreign owner or consignee at that time of entry. And if you are relying on a representative of a foreign owner, there does need to be a signed statement of consent to serve as the importer under the subpart. So just be aware that you do need that statement of consent. And there's going to be the FSVP importer is going to be declared on every line item at import. So it's the FSVP importer is not always going to be your importer of record. There's some flexibility, as you can see here. It can be a US owner or consignee, or it could be a US agent or representative of a foreign owner. Now, if we look at the definition of a US owner or consignee, that can mean a person in the US who at the time of US entry has done one of these three things. They own the food, they have purchased the food, or they've agreed in writing to purchase the food. So it's very possible that in your business relationships, you could make the retailer the FSVP importer. Whoever the importer is, whoever this FSVP importer is, would be required to essentially carry out a supply chain program. Okay. Under the FSVP regulations, it's called a Foreign Supplier Verification Program. And it matches up pretty perfectly with the supply chain program requirements of Subpart G. So if you are already being subject to Part 117 and you're subject to Subpart C and G, then you are considered in compliance with the FSVP regulations. There is just one other thing you have to do, and we can talk about that at the very end of this presentation if you'd like. But essentially it's 1.509. That section of the code, 1.509, is what you're required to do at customs. Okay, so the importer then from customs is picked up and brought to a distributor warehouse. The distributor stores jalapeno flakes in the warehouse until a truck picks it up and transports it to a manufacturer. This manufacturer, in this case, it happens to be a co-manufacturer, adds the jalapeno flakes to jack cheese. A transporter then picks it up and takes it to a second factory where a processor slices the cheese and packages it in modified atmosphere packaged trays. Okay, so now we have a finished product. The finished product is then picked up by a transporter, brought to a distributor warehouse, where a transporter then picks it up and delivers it to retail to be sold to the consumer. A pretty complicated supply chain for a simple piece of pepper jack cheese. So here are my questions. We have A through J on the bottom, and then we have K through S up top. Who's a receiving facility? So remember, a receiving facility is somebody who is subject to C and G and buys the food from somebody. So in this case, we have a processor who is going to be processing the food, and so they're subject to C and G. They're also buying this from a supplier somewhere farther upstream. Here we have a manufacturer who makes cheese, so they're subject to C and G, and they also buy a food. In this case, it's the dried flakes of jalapenos that they're adding to their cheese. So they would be a receiving facility. And next would be the processor slicing cheese for all the same reasons. So these would be the three entities in the supply chain that would be considered receiving facilities. That means they're creating documentation around their applied controls. And so these are great entities to be able to pass documentation through the supply chain. All right, so who's a supplier? So remember, a supplier is someone who's not processing the food beyond a de minimis nature. So in this case, we have three. We have the farmer who's supplying the jalapenos. We have a factory who's supplying the jalapeno flakes to letter G, the factory that's making the cheese. And then we have G. This factory is manufacturing the cheese and supplying it to factory H, which is then slicing it. So the reason H is not a supplier is because they have no one downstream that's subject to C and G. So they're not supplying anyone with a food safety plan a food. They might be a supplier of the transporters and the warehouse and retailers, but we're not considering them a supplier in the context of the supply of the PC regulations. So who's a non-supplier? Well, there's a lot of them. So we're not going to go through all these different entities, but these are the entities between a receiving facility and a supplier. Okay, so these are the entities that can choose to provide support by passing documentation or performing reviews and assessments of suppliers, so they can go ahead and make those accounts somewhere else downstream. Okay, so in this case, customers are just going to be those that are entities downstream from a receiving facility. So any one of these could be considered a customer. Now, why is it important to call out? Because a customer can apply a control, in which case you might not require a supply chain applied control because you would be relying on an entity downstream to apply that control to control the hazard that you've identified. So once you get into the game of relying on customers, there's going to be a need for an exchange of disclosures which would accompany the food, and assurances that would come typically annually to give you assurance that the customer in fact is going to be applying the controls and following the processes and procedures that you agree to. Okay, so that's why it's important to call out customers. So who applies the supply chain applied control in this example? In this case, it's going to be factory C. So this is the processor who cooks, dries, and packages the jalapeno flakes to begin with. So if we were worried about salmonella coming from upstream, C would likely be able to be the one to go ahead and control for salmonella. So G is going to be manufacturing the cheese. It's possible that they may be pasteurizing the milk, but normally the flakes are added after pasteurization. So be aware that the supply chain applied control might be necessary because this customer may not be applying that control. And then H, this processor slices and packages cheese, but they're not a supplier because, so if they were applying a control, it would have to be a process preventive control. So this might be, for example, sterilizing the cheese somehow as it's in its packaging. So a likely scenario, this entity applies. So C is an entity that would apply and document the supply chain applied control. G would likely review and assess the foreign entity's records and document the review and assessment. And H could go ahead and review and assess the documented review and assessment from the manufacturer. Okay. Now there is another entity that could help things out here. That could be E, the importer. So if you're relying on a FSVP importer that's not you, that person would be required to comply with the FSVP regulation, and in doing so would perform a review and assessment which they document, and that document would be able to move through the supply chain, and you could rely on that. So there are a number of people here that have foreign suppliers. You can, if you have not already identified the FSVP importer, you'll need to have that discussion with the entities involved in your supply chain and figure out who it's going to be, if not you, and you can go ahead and rely on the reviews and assessments that that entity might perform. Okay, so that's our presentation. I have some additional slides that illustrate what a approved supplier list might look like, or a verification log. but I do want to open up the presentation to some Q&A. I'm going to go ahead and open up my view. De minimis, what does de minimis mean? I have just gotten these little chats. De minimis means things that are not significant. So if your supplier is taking a food and maybe perhaps labeling it, or taking it out of its box and putting it in a new box, that might be an example of something de minimis in nature. So it wouldn't be creating a hazard, and it wouldn't necessarily be exacerbating anything. So in this case, we have something of de minimis nature. Are there any questions that you guys have? If so, go ahead and text these or throw these into the chat. I'll have that open, and until I see anything, I'll go ahead and move through the additional slides that I've brought today. Okay. So, approved supplier list. So this is just an example. Right now, there's not too much guidance out there from FDA okay, I see some text, that's great. So I'll jump into approved supplier list in a moment. So the first question is, where are the packing houses or warehouses a supplier? The PCHF applies to holding food. Yes, it's true. So the preventive controls for human food rule does apply to storage facilities that are simply holding food, but you'll remember that they're not subject to subparts C and G. So, so they wouldn't be considered, they're not subject to the food safety requirements. So I suppose they could be considered a supplier, but they're likely not doing anything beyond something of de minimis nature, because they're simply holding the food and moving it. Packing houses, it's a tricky question because packing houses could identify a hazard that requires preventive control, and so they wouldn't, in that case, they might not be able to benefit from circumstances that would free them from implementing preventive control management components. Just a simple answer there is subpart D has modified requirements, and 117.2.06 would be the set of regulations that would say, okay, you're storing food that is packaged, and maybe it needs refrigeration, in which case we want you to keep records of the refrigeration, but you're not required to have a food safety plan. So that's where they would not be a supplier, because in that case, they really wouldn't be doing anything beyond de minimis nature. If they were freezing something or doing any other kind of activity that fell under the definition of manufacturing processing that was not of de minimis nature, so that doesn't include labeling, then they, that would be where you'd make the determination of whether or not they'd be your true supplier or just some other entity in the supply chain. In other words, a non-supplier. Okay, so that's my answer for you, Lissa. Patrick, I got some questions from you. Why are all transporters considered considered non-suppliers in your foreign supplier scenario? So transporters are not doing anything to the product. I suppose they're considered non-suppliers because they are an entity in the supply chain between the receiving facility and the supplier. They're just not doing anything beyond de minimis nature. So they're not doing anything that would make them your true supplier. And when I say true supplier, what I mean is that you would be considered the supplier under the preventive controls for human food regulations. So you have to process or manufacture a good to some extent where you're going beyond the de minimis nature to become a supplier. So just be aware of that. Your transporters are going to be your non-suppliers. They're the entities in the supply chain that where their only real utility. Well, there was an amendment. They did amend the definition of adulterated with FSMA, where they said if something is transported under insanitary conditions, it could adulterate the food. So be aware, while I might not say they're your supplier within the context of the preventive controls for human food regulations, they can still potentially adulterate your product if they're transporting if they're a covered business under the Sanitary Transportation for Human and Animal Food Rule, and they are not complying with those regulations. They might be using equipment or like vehicles or refrigeration equipment that is not up to the standard up to the code, and in which case FDA would have the authority to say that the food is adulterated. So that's the scary part about non-suppliers, is that you could do everything in your power to move your food from a supplier to you or from you to a customer, and the food could be thrown in the garbage because the transporter was out of compliance. They would effectively adulterate the product. So is this likely to happen? I don't think so, but it really depends on who your partners are and why people are lawyering up and making sure that their contracts with their suppliers, with their transporters, are identifying liability should the food be adulterated in transit. Okay, so let's see, I think I answered that question. Why are all transporters not considered non-suppliers in your foreign supply? Oh, okay. But why are all transporters not considered non-suppliers? So I did consider all my transporters non-suppliers. We could go back and take a look, but all the transporters in this case would be non-suppliers because they are not manufacturing and processing the food beyond a de minimis nature. Okay, Guna, if the storage facilities import ingredients for R&D purposes only, are they required for FSVP requirements? So they're just like in the supply chain program, so it's just like in the preventive controls for human food regulations in subpart G. FSVP does provide circumstances where the FSVP would not be required, and that would be in this case here, where if you're receiving food in that comes in a size that indicates that it's for R&D, and that it comes with a statement, so a disclosure that it's for R&D. There's a number of different circumstances, so I'm not going to enumerate all of them here, but you can certainly bypass the regulations for R&D, but there are certain requirements in the regulations that you have to meet. So some people ask me, well, what about if I'm just sending samples to a trade show? So FDA in the preamble does say that trade shows are considered the general public, and they would not consider that something that would be for R&D. If you're bringing something in so you can go ahead and manufacture a practice run of a food that will eventually find its way into your lab and garbage, then that's a different story. Okay, so I'm going to move on. I hope that answered your question, Guna. Let me know if it did. What about sanitary transport rule? Well, I talked about that briefly in my answer to Patrick, which I addressed that if you're a covered business under the Sanitary Transportation for Human and Animal Food Rule, you would still, it wouldn't make you a supplier necessarily. You still have to manufacture or process the food beyond a de minimis nature, but you could potentially adulterate the food. So, obviously, if you destroyed the packaging, if you of the food and rendered it, susceptible to cross-contamination or cross-contact, or if you were out of compliance with the way in which you maintained your equipment, then or if you didn't train your employees, for example, that's another regulation where FDA is going to be enforcing. So they're going to have to document that they're training their employees. There are a number of conditions where FDA could say your food's been adulterated in transit. So that's a really important rule for you to pay attention to if you're involved in a complex supply chain. Just be aware that the Sanitary Transportation for Human and Animal Food Rule does not apply to air or boats, and it doesn't apply to transporters abroad. That being said, in the FSVP regulations, they do require that you address transportation abroad as you're evaluating your suppliers. So that's a part of that. I think it was the second or third option I mentioned in your evaluation, things to consider, entities applying the control. You need to be aware of how your food's being transported, whether it's on boat or air or otherwise, but these would not be subject to the to the sanitary transportation rule if they're foreign or air or boat. Or it does apply to vehicles and rail. So just be aware those are the two conditions where that rule would be relevant. Okay, Patrick, the last two transporter roles were not highlighted on your slide and were considered customers, I think. So it could be a distributor that has the transport. Thank you so much for bringing that up. The transporter could own vehicles, and they could be picking up your food, and so they could be considered a customer. So in that case, I suppose I didn't give enough. I ran out of space on those slides, Patrick. There were so many entities, but it's a very good point, and I'm glad you're paying so close attention. A customer could be someone that buys the food and delivers it to another entity. So in that case, they could be a potential customer, I suppose. So in that case, oh, also, when we're talking about non-suppliers, we're normally talking about entities that are farther upstream. So you're typically not considering, I kind of made a distinction there where I said transporters downstream would be potential customers, and transporters upstream would be potential non-supplier, would be considered non-suppliers. So maybe, hopefully that gives some clarification to your question there. Okay. So if there are any other questions, let me know. I live for this stuff, so please shoot me any questions. If you want it personal, you can drop me an email, michael@foodsafetyguides.com, and you can drop me a personal email there, and I can address it and perhaps your question a little more specifically. So we do have another minute, and here I have the approved supplier list. So here I've identified the food. I've identified the supplier, whether or not they're approved or being used temporarily, the date and signature of the person approving the supplier. I can refer back to a supply chain preventive control that I may be detailed in my food safety plan for verification activity and frequency. So that might be a default, but you do want to be able to identify on your approved supplier list deviations from this preventive control. You might want to increase the frequency, for example, of a verification activity, or couple the verification activity with another verification activity. So the next section here is the verification activity conducted by another entity? You might be just reviewing something by another entity. In this case, I might have a consistent distributor where I'd be reviewing their documented review and assessment. What about modified requirements? Do those apply? In this case, I say there's a qualified facility, in which case I don't need to refer to my supply chain preventive control. I could refer to the requirements for approving qualified facilities, which are detailed in subpart G in the regulation itself. So this, I think I should have written no here, but that's an example of a supplier list where you're identifying the verification activity, the frequency, and you've been able to show that it's been approved. And this would be a go-to list for your purchasing department to be able to purchase from suppliers. Obviously, you could have this integrated into some kind of software. So this is not the only way you might be creating a supplier approval list. And we're out of time. This was a supplier verification receiving log, but again, just an example. But thank you so much for having me here. Really enjoy talking about these regulations. It's a passion of mine. A lot of people, they play chess or they take hikes. I love this stuff. And I do teach FSVP at SES Global Services. So, and I've had a really wonderful relationship with SES, and I look forward to seeing you in their training room.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thanks everybody for joining us. So this is Diane with SCS, and if you have any other questions about our courses, you can check out our website or give me a call. Thanks. Bye-bye.